All right, let's look at 2.2 of Chapter 2. We're on the birth of a nation. We've just read about and studied the American Revolution, the events leading up to the American Revolution, and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So we have declared our independence, and of course we won with Yorktown. And the Treaty of Paris of 1783 is going to end the war and give us our independence, but also our territory. So let's look at how we go about establishing a government. Prior to this, throughout the war, we had been governed by the Second Continental Congress, and it was good for what it was. We needed somebody to keep us together, and each of the states, colonies, and then states was represented in the Congress, so it worked well. We had a very common goal. But now that we're a new country, we need to go about establishing a government. And I don't want to say this is difficult. They knew what they wanted to do. They knew what they didn't want. But trying to make something work out of just brand new is difficult. This is the first time it's been done pretty much in human history, breaking away from mother country and having to establish a government. And consider that most all of our government is based on English tradition. Okay, so the new states created a confederation form of government. They were very cautious about giving too much authority to a central government, and a confederation is a perfect way of doing this. A confederation is, I like to call it a league of friendship. There is no true leader. All 13 states are equal. They're basically like their own little country, and they are only loosely unified together with a very, very weak central government. Now, the Articles of Confederation, of course, do fail because it doesn't give enough power to the federal government to lead effectively. They can't solve the problems that are going to arise in the new United States. That is not to say that it is completely useless. There were three really good, strong parts to the Articles of Confederation. All three of them dealt with territory. All three of them dealt with our land. One was the creation of the national domain. The national domain is land that belongs to the country, to the United States. Now, when the United States was formed, some states like North Carolina, Georgia, New York, Massachusetts, Virginia particularly, they have their territory doesn't just end at the Appalachian Mountains. It just keeps on going out to the edge of our territory, out to now what would be the Mississippi River. If you look at some of those maps, it'll take it all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. But really they have that territory. Now remember what we talked about with mercantilism and with the English. Territory equals land. One, you've got a lot of natural resources on it, but also states can sell that land and raise revenue also. So the more Western land you have, the more money, the more power you have. But as the national domain, as they're talking about creating this new country, your smaller states, Connecticut's one. South Carolina did not have much in the way of Western territory either. New Jersey, they don't like the idea of creating this new government because they feel like the larger states will have more power. So the larger states had to compromise, and so they all 13 states decided that any Western territory that a state had would be ceded to the national government. Okay, so they all gave their Western territories to the United States government, and that becomes the national domain. Next question is, how do we divide those Western territories? The first law is the Land Ordinance of 1785, and it's going to divide the territories into a system of townships to facilitate the sale of land to settlers. So essentially this is a method of distributing land. Now, this is mostly what you're going to see. Well, I'm just going to leave it at that. Think about when you go out west. If you've ever been out west, you'll notice everything's in straight lines. And trying to, just like this right here, this is how it set it up. And you can see you've got this grid system. Okay, these townships are split into 6 by 6 miles, square miles. A lot of land here is available, and if you look down here in this area right here, you can see how it can be divided. Okay, so the whole thing, the half of it is 320, so all of it is 640 acres. Okay, so that's a good bit of territory, and you split it. Let me back out of that. But that's how you split it. Okay. And you'll notice too where it's mostly looking at this Northwest Territory right here, and this specifically is Ohio territory, but you can see it's up here in the north. This is not the entire Western Territory. You also have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This one is important, even though I've got its second one, but this decides the process by which new states could be admitted into the Union. Importantly enough, though, this is the first national law that's going to deal with slavery, and it is going to declare slavery illegal in the Northwest Territory. That's going to come back later on us when we get to some of our compromises. But you can see the area in green. This is the Northwest Territory right here. Okay, but look at step 3. Once a population reaches 60,000 people, the territory can become a state with its own government and constitution. And here's kind of how you go back, about doing that. But it's interesting, this still exists today, and that's what's great about these 3. This is what makes it out of the Articles and really into our new government. Okay. Get a good look at that. These are the only strengths of that new government, of the Articles of Confederation. What we're going to look at next is all of the weaknesses, and everything else is a weakness. Okay, taxes. You know, how many of you love taxes? Think about how great taxes are. We are taxed by the federal government. You have federal income taxes. You have state income taxes. You have local taxes, property taxes, car taxes, sales taxes. Pretty much anything you can think of can be taxed. Okay. Federal taxes, though, under the Articles, were something that the states were not willing to give up. So the Articles didn't grant Congress the power to impose any taxes. They could ask the states for money, but imagine me coming up to your class and saying, hey, I need to buy some classroom supplies. Who wants to donate 20 bucks? There'll be that one person who says, yeah, here you go. It's for a good cause. Some people say, well, it ain't worth $20 to me, but I can see me using $5 worth. Here's 5. Some of you are going to be like, you know what? I have like a quarter and 3 pennies in my pocket. I can use the quarter, but you can have the pennies. And some of you are going to be going like, whatever. I've asked, and I've only gotten a little bit for what I asked for, okay? So that was the problem with taxes. They just didn't have the power to tax. And think about everything that our government today does with taxes. And that would be everything that government under the Articles couldn't do. One of the issues that one of the things they couldn't do is really defend or protect the United States. Because there's no tax money, we didn't have an army. That meant that we couldn't oppose the actions of the British and the Spanish in the West. The British refused, and this gets into foreign diplomacy, the British refused to withdraw from the Ohio River Valley. We're like, you know, hey, you need to leave. You promised us this is ours. We have a treaty. You see, you signed it. And they're standing there like, yeah, you and what army's gonna make me move out? Nobody could make a move. We didn't have the force behind it. Nobody fears that. Okay. Spain also isn't worried about us, so they're going to close their port at New Orleans, which is going to cut off the Mississippi River for us. I mean, we can travel up and down it, but we can't travel out of it, which is going to disrupt trade that we have out there. And Spain has no reason to talk to us. They don't fear us. Okay, so you can see how all three of these are related. Because we don't have taxes, we don't have an army, and nobody has a reason to speak to us. What are you going to do? Hurt us? What are you going to do? Attack us? No, nobody's afraid of us. Okay. In addition to the foreign issues in terms of defense, it also meant that when we have our first rebellion, specifically Shays' Rebellion, um, Massachusetts can't deal with it, or the United States doesn't deal with it. We don't have an army, and Massachusetts has to deal with it on their own. Daniel Shays is a Revolutionary War veteran. He owns a farm in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has a lot of war debt. How do you pay debt? How do states pay debts? They raise taxes. So they're going to raise the tax on Daniel Shays' land. He can't pay it. And so he's going to get a bunch of farmers who are in the same position as him, and they're not going to rebel to shut down the government. They're not going to attack the government per se. They're going to march on the courts and shut down the courts, because it's the courts who issue the foreclosure notices. Okay, and they're going to rise up, and they're going to move, and they're going to make their way to close the courts. Luckily, Massachusetts had their own militia, and they were able to put it down. I will point out that Shays' Rebellion is extremely important, and I'm going to get back to that in a second. Okay. The other problem with the government was just the way it was set up. Okay, just the way it was set up. This is a tree with one branch, which is nothing. Okay, you have just Congress. There is no executive branch. There is no judiciary. We have no court system. If you want to pass a law, 75% of the states have to agree. In other words, 9 out of 13 states. And finally, if you want to change, if you want to amend the articles, all 13 states have to agree. Now, we might find a few ways, a few things to be unanimous on, but I'm going to be honest with you, it's almost impossible for that to happen here, because Rhode Island never showed up. Okay, so you never would have had the unanimous decision to change it. Which let's go back to Shays' Rebellion. Okay, like I said, it was a tax rebellion, and this rebellion is going to make it evident that we need a stronger central government. Okay, we need a strong central government to deal with, one, diplomacy, problems here, problems here. Well, we need that, and what we have is not working. So the leaders, there's a meeting already called in Philadelphia to discuss trade. So the states are going to kind of discuss it between them, and they're going to make the decision to all send delegates to this, and their purpose is to revise. Revise is another word for amend, which means to change the Articles of Confederation. This was not meant to do away with the Articles. They were just going to change it. But then, of course, your problem arises when I said that you have to have all 13 states agree. And of course, Rhode Island just, again, was a no-show. When they got to the Constitutional Convention, you've got 13 very different states. Excuse me, Rhode Island doesn't show up. You've got 12 very different states. You've got 3 very different sections. Now we can pretty much just kind of narrow it down to the North and the South. Okay. The New England and former New England and Middle colonies are going to pretty much vote together, and the Southern colonies are going to vote together. And we have some big issues that we've got to solve, okay? And one of the things that they realized when they got there is, if we're not going to compromise, if we're not going to work together, if we're not going to have some give and take, then it's going to fall apart. And I think that that's one of the things that makes the founding fathers such great men. It's not their position, it's not their intelligence, though great. It was their willingness to compromise, and some of these are tough compromises that today we look on today. We would never make these compromises today. I'm going to just leave it at that. The first is the Great Compromise. The issue here was representation in the legislative branch. How are we going to represent everybody? Under the Articles, each state sent one person, so each state had one representative. The people aren't represented at all in the Articles of Confederation, okay? So now we're looking to change that. The Virginia plan called for a two-house legislature in which both houses were based on population. Now, this is great for Virginia, which has a large population. It is great for New York, which has a large population. New Jersey, not so much. South Carolina, not so much. They have small populations. So states like that are going to fall in with the New Jersey plan. They wanted a one-house or a unicameral legislature in which each state had one representative and got one vote per state, essentially keeping it the same way as what we had seen under the Articles of Confederation. By the way, another word for a two-house legislature is a bicameral system. Okay. The result here is like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You're going to take the Virginia plan, you're going to take the New Jersey plan, you're going to slap them together, and we're going to end up with the Great Compromise. Okay. We're going to establish a two-house legislature, that bicameral system, and your lower house is going to be the House of Representatives, and it is going to be elected directly by the people. And the number of representatives was based on the state population. Now, understand that at the time, not today, but at the time, the House of Representatives is the only federal position directly elected by the people. Okay? The Senate is going to be elected, or is going to be elected by the state legislatures, okay? The Senate doesn't represent the people. The Senate represents the state, okay? And so each state would have 2 senators, okay, which is a little different than what the New Jersey plan had called for, but you still see equal representation, okay? The next compromise deals with slavery, and it goes along with the Great Compromise, because we talked about our legislative branch here, and we talked about, particularly with the House of Representatives, that the number of representatives is based on population. Who do we count as people? The North has fewer slaves, and they didn't feel like they should be counted as people, because in reality, a slave, legally speaking, was not considered a person but property. Okay. The South had a lot of slaves, and they want them counted as part of the population, because this is going to give them a larger population to count toward representation in Congress. So more people equals more power in Congress. What doesn't make it into the final version of everything, I guess you could say, is that the North wanted to tax each state, and they wanted slaves counted for tax purposes. So the whole slave issue is so hard to get around, because morally speaking, we know it's wrong. And you have a group of people sitting around compromising over this issue. And a lot of people, again, today would say, this isn't something we compromise on, and would leave it at that. But understand that if they had left this alone and they had just said no, if the northern states had said, no, we won't compromise on this, the South would have walked out and we would not have had the United States. Okay. The resulting compromise is that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. This is significant. States like South Carolina, believe it or not, most of South Carolina had more than 50% of its population was slave. Okay, this was a powerful compromise for the South. Okay, and this really boosted their representative numbers. Another issue with slavery was the slave trade compromise. At issue was giving the federal government the power over international trade. The South was concerned. If interstate trade, interstate commerce, international trade, they're really concerned, because if they give this power to the federal government, then the federal government could at any point make the international slave trade illegal. And again, go back up to this, to who has the power in Congress. And we'll talk about this when we get closer to the Civil War. You begin to see how the North grows and they become more powerful in Congress because of their very dynamic population and immigration. The result of this, the compromise itself, is that the Northerners agreed to allow the international slave trade to continue for 20 years before Congress could regulate it. Now, to give the South their due, they had a right to be concerned, because as soon as that 20 years was up in 1807 or 1808, I've seen it both places, Congress is going to vote to make the international slave trade illegal. So there are no new slaves coming into the United States after 1808. The final issue is the Bill of Rights. You have two groups at this point, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute. One is the Federalists, and the other is the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists are the ones who supported the Constitution as it was written in its original format. No Bill of Rights. They didn't feel like a Bill of Rights was needed. They felt like individual liberty would be guaranteed through checks and balances and separation of powers and the basic setup. But the Anti-Federalists fear a strong central government, and they wanted stronger state governments. And part of the reason was that the state government is closest to us, and they can more closely protect our rights. Okay, at the time, the first capital is in Philadelphia. Think about how far away your federal government is if you are in, South Carolina. And the next one is in New York, and finally Washington. But even Washington at this point, well, is a good little ways away. Our state government, comparatively speaking, is close, and if we have an issue, we can appeal to that a whole lot quicker. Just that's the reason for wanting these strong state governments as opposed to a strong federal government. But the other thing is that they didn't feel like the Constitution went far enough to protect individual rights. Think about that list of things that led up to the Revolutionary War, the writs of assistance. There was nothing in this Constitution that would protect you from any kind of illegal searches and seizures. The Quartering Act, remember the Intolerable Acts that set up that Quartering Act? There is nothing in here to protect us from the government forcing us to house soldiers. Even General Gage in Boston had gone to Concord to seize the guns. We have a right to bear arms, but that's not listed in the original Constitution, nor is some of the protections that we had seen with Magna Carta or with the English Bill of Rights. No cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, all of these things that we put into our Bill of Rights are things that we were used to, and we wanted to see it written down. It's hard to take away something that's listed specifically. Okay? The result is that we do end up with a Bill of Rights. However, there's a little bit of trust involved here. It can't be done until the Constitution's been ratified. So the Anti-Federalists had to agree to ratify the Constitution and trust the Federalists to keep their word. It did happen. They did keep their word. And so we have the first 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791. Now, going back to the Federalists, I mentioned, those two groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and this fight to ratify the Constitution. Each state had to ratify. Each state. It's not one big get together and all of the states come together and we all have this big rally. Each state had to have a constitutional convention. And the people in each state had to vote to accept it. And it was a hard fight in some states. South Carolina, I think, was the 8th state to make it. New York was not the last state. By the time New York ratified it, it was already the law of the land. You had to have 9 out of 13 ratify it. But New York had a hard time getting it ratified, and so the Federalist Papers were written in a New York paper. Okay, the purpose here was to persuade the New York legislature to ratify the Constitution. You notice how many persuasive essays and persuasive things we've seen this chapter. They're written anonymously by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And like I said, there's a series of essays published, and they were meant to persuade the New York legislature and the people of New York to ratify the Constitution. And again, they are going to ratify it, and eventually what we're going to see is the Constitution ratified and a Bill of Rights added. All right. I had a wonderful picture of Hamilton and Jefferson right here, and it is not showing up. But that's okay. Wait a minute. That was the end of 2.2. That was it for this one, okay? We'll move on to 2.3 in a minute, next time we get to one, okay?